Two women, two tragic deaths, years apart, yet connected in a way that still raises questions. In 2020, Grace Holland was found dead inside her home. Authorities ruled it a suicide. Nearly 4 years later, in that same home, Dr. Sarah Sweeney was found unresponsive. Her death was later classified as an overdose, with the manner listed as undetermined. Both women shared one connection, a relationship with Robert Daus. Officials have stated there is no evidence of foul play in either case, but for the families involved, the questions never went away. How could two separate tragedies happen under such similar circumstances? Is it simply coincidence, or are there details that still haven't been fully understood? This is a story not about accusations, but about unanswered questions, conflicting perspectives, and a mystery that continues to linger. Because sometimes the most unsettling cases are the ones that don't have clear answers. Grace Holland was known as someone who brought light into every room she entered. At 35 years old, she had built a life full of friendships, ambition, and resilience. Friends described her as intelligent, warm, and deeply caring, someone who had weathered life's hardships but never let them define her. She lived in the St. Louis area, a city where her life seemed to be settling into a steady rhythm. But behind the scenes, Grace's personal life was far more complicated. She was in a relationship with Robert Daus, a respected fire captain in the St. Louis area. To outsiders, Daus appeared to be a pillar of the community, someone trusted, disciplined, and heroic by profession. But those closest to Grace would later describe something very different. According to family members and court documents, Grace's relationship with Daus had troubling elements. There were allegations of emotional and verbal abuse, patterns of control, manipulation, and tension that were never visible to the outside world. Still, Grace stayed. Like many in complicated relationships, she may have believed things could improve, or perhaps she felt trapped in ways others couldn't see. Despite the challenges, Grace continued to move forward. She maintained contact with loved ones, made plans, and showed no clear signs that her life was about to take a tragic turn. There were no obvious warnings, no clear signals, nothing that suggested that in just a short time, everything would change forever. Then came July 2020. A date that would mark the beginning of a mystery that still hasn't been resolved. On a quiet day in July 2020, everything came to a sudden and violent end. Grace Holland was found dead inside the home she shared with Robert Daus. The cause? A single gunshot wound to the head. It was the kind of scene that immediately raises questions about what happened in those final moments and whether the truth would ever be fully known. Authorities responded quickly. Investigators examined the scene, collected evidence, and began piecing together what had happened. But the conclusion they reached would shock Grace's family. The death was ruled a suicide. According to official findings, Grace had inflicted the gunshot wound herself. Case closed. But for those who knew her best, nothing about that conclusion made sense. Almost immediately, doubts began to surface. Grace was right-handed, yet the gunshot wound was located on the left side of her head. To her family, that detail alone raised serious concerns. Then there were the suicide notes. Authorities reported that notes had been found at the scene, suggesting intent, but Grace's family claimed something didn't add up. They insisted the handwriting didn't match hers. To them, it wasn't just suspicious, it was impossible. As grief turned into determination, her loved ones began to question everything about the investigation, and one question stood above all others. Was this really suicide? Or was something being overlooked? Grace Holland's family refused to accept the official ruling. For them, the inconsistencies were too significant to ignore.
They began speaking out publicly, determined to bring attention to what they believed was a deeply flawed investigation. Their concerns weren't based on emotion alone. They pointed to specific details: the position of the gunshot wound, the disputed handwriting in the alleged suicide notes, and most importantly, Grace's state of mind. Family members insisted that Grace had not shown signs of suicidal intent. She had plans, connections, and a future she was actively engaged in. To them, the narrative simply didn't fit. Grace Holland's family refused to accept the official ruling. For them, the inconsistencies were too significant to ignore. They began speaking out publicly, determined to bring attention to what they believed was a deeply flawed investigation. Their concerns weren't based on emotion alone. They pointed to specific details: the position of the gunshot wound, the disputed handwriting in the alleged suicide notes, and most importantly, Grace's state of mind. Family members insisted that Grace had not shown signs of suicidal intent. She had plans, connections, and a future she was actively engaged in. To them, the narrative simply didn't fit.
After Grace's death, life moved on, at least on the surface. Robert Daus remained in the St. Louis area, continuing his career as a fire captain. To many, the tragedy of 2020 faded into the background. But then, another woman entered the picture: Dr. Sarah Sweeney. At 39 years old, Sarah was a respected podiatrist, educated, accomplished, and deeply dedicated to her work. She had built a successful career and was known for her professionalism and compassion. At some point, she and Daus began a relationship. Eventually, she moved into the same home where Grace Holland had died. To outsiders, it may have seemed like a fresh start, a new chapter. But beneath the surface, echoes of the past remained. Sarah's family would later raise concerns similar to those expressed by Grace's loved ones. They described emotional struggles, tension, and patterns that felt unsettlingly familiar. Still, no one could have predicted what would happen next, because in January 2024, history would repeat itself.
In January 2024, emergency services received a call from Robert Daus. Inside the same home where Grace Holland had died years earlier, Dr. Sarah Sweeney was found unresponsive. Despite efforts to save her, she was pronounced dead. Once again, investigators were called to the scene. Once again, questions began to form. This time, the cause of death was determined to be a drug overdose. The substances involved included oxycodone, gabapentin, and diphenhydramine, a dangerous combination.
But the most critical detail wasn't just the cause of death. It was the classification. The manner of death was listed as undetermined. Not suicide, not accident, not homicide. Undetermined. Authorities stated that Sarah appeared to have been alone before her death. And once again, Robert Daus was the one who made the emergency call. For investigators, there was no immediate evidence of foul play. But for Sarah's family, the similarities were impossible to ignore. Same man, same house, 2 women, 2 deaths, and still no clear answers. As details of Sarah Sweeney's death became public, comparisons to Grace Holland's case began to surface almost immediately. The parallels were striking. Both women were in relationships with Robert Daus. Both lived in the same home. Both died under circumstances that left lingering questions. And in both cases, families raised concerns about alleged abuse. Court documents and public statements pointed to patterns of emotional and verbal control, behavior that, while difficult to prove criminally, painted a troubling picture. For many observers, it wasn't just about what could be proven. It was about what felt undeniable. 2 tragedies connected by the same person raised a deeper question. How many coincidences are too many? Despite the public speculation, law enforcement remained firm. They stated that neither case showed evidence of murder. No charges were filed, no suspect was named, and Robert Daus continued to maintain his position and his freedom. Still, the court of public opinion told a different story. Online discussions grew, media coverage intensified, and the families of both women continued to push for answers, because for them, this wasn't just a mystery, it was personal. As the cases gained attention, media outlets began highlighting the eerie similarities between the two deaths. Headlines questioned the odds. Podcasts dissected timelines. Online communities analyzed every detail. For the families, the attention was both a blessing and a burden. On one hand, it kept the cases alive. On the other, it meant reliving the pain again and again. They spoke out, hoping that public pressure might lead to renewed investigations. They wanted transparency, accountability,
answers. But as of early 2024, authorities maintained their stance. No evidence of homicide, no criminal charges, no change in conclusions. Still, the questions refused to disappear, because sometimes the absence of evidence doesn't feel like the presence of truth. And in cases like these, doubt can be just as powerful as proof.
Today, the stories of Grace Holland and Dr. Sarah Sweeney remain deeply intertwined. Two lives, two deaths, one connection that cannot be ignored. Officially, there is no confirmed crime linking Robert Daus to either death, but unofficially, the questions remain louder than ever. Was Grace Holland's death truly a suicide? Was Sarah Sweeney's overdose an accident or something more? Or is this a case where the truth exists but has yet to be uncovered? For the families, the fight continues.
They are not just seeking justice, they are seeking clarity. Because without answers, there can be no closure. And until those answers come, this case will remain what it has always been: a haunting mystery, one that forces us to confront a difficult reality. Sometimes, the most unsettling stories are not the ones with clear villains, but the ones where the truth is still out there, waiting to be found.